Hurricane Debby made landfall this morning in Florida, becoming the second hurricane making landfall in the United States in the 2024 hurricane season so far. My name is Brett Waltz, BAMWX.com meteorologist, and in this video, we're going to talk about why the pattern in terms of tropical activity across the Atlantic Ocean is likely to ramp up in a substantial nature over the next few weeks. And it's not just because we're getting into the peak climatology timeframe of hurricane season. There are multiple different pattern drivers that we're watching right now that are going to favor perhaps the risk for additional landfalling hurricanes, maybe even more major hurricanes as we go over the next several weeks. Let's start out with Hurricane Debby, though. I think it's important for us to keep in mind regarding hurricanes in terms of the categories, category 1, 2, 3, and beyond on the Saffir-Simpson scale. It's only measuring wind, doesn't necessarily tell us what's going on with rainfall and with storm surge. And in the case of Debby, the observed rainfall so far is kind of off the charts. Debby is a very slow moving storm, and in fact, it's actually going to continue to slow down as it moves further to the north. So even though it's going to weaken, it's going to continue to dump some extremely heavy rainfall across Florida and then eventually Georgia and the Carolina coast as we work over the next few days. So far, Debby has already put down, if we look at our clarity observed rainfall, it's already put down more than a foot of rain north of Gainesville, Florida so far. And again, still dropping some very heavy rain across the area. If we take a look at what we're going to expect to happen with Debby over the next few days, we'll continue to slowly meander off to the north and then really stall out right off the coast of South Carolina or North Carolina as we work into Wednesday and into your Thursday, which will ultimately allow for heavy rain just to sit across that region as we work into the mid to latter part of this week before it eventually starts to push off to the northeast as it gets caught up by a cold front late this week and into the weekend. Still will be producing some heavy rain all along the East Coast as we work over the weekend and eventually into early next week, beginning to quiet things down. In terms of additional rainfall expected, parts of the Carolinas, probably another 10 to 15 inches of rain will fall over the next 7 days associated with the remnants of Debby. And we'll be looking at several inches of rain all the way up into parts of New Jersey, New York, and the northeastern part of the country. So Debby's impacts will continue to be felt well beyond after it has lost its tropical storm or hurricane status. Then the question is, what happens after Debby? We're already keeping an eye on potential development in the southern Caribbean and then eventually into the Gulf of Mexico as we work late this week and into the weekend, perhaps into early next week. We'll need to be keeping an eye on a potential system that will work through some very, very warm ocean waters and a rather favorable environment for development. Still a little bit too early to get into specifics on this particular storm, but I think it highlights what is going to be a theme over the next several weeks, and that's going to be numerous opportunities for additional tropical cyclone development. That begs the question, why are we getting so active now? The ocean waters have been near record warm levels throughout really the entirety of this season, but we're just now kind of starting to get more consistent activity developing. One of the reasons, aside from just getting into the peak climatology of hurricane season, is a pattern driver that we call the Madden-Julian Oscillation, or the MJO. May sound like a crazy fancy term, and there is a lot that goes into it, but it can simply be defined as a cluster of thunderstorms that moves from west to east across the equator. Typically what happens is when you get all of this upward motion along the equator, it tends to enhance the ability for thunderstorm clusters to develop and to organize into tropical cyclones. Right now, what we're seeing happen is this tropical activity, this thunderstorm activity, moving from Africa through the Atlantic Ocean and into the Indian Ocean. As it does that, it tends to allow for waves to develop and push off the coast of Africa out into the Atlantic Ocean, and those then can then form into hurricanes. Looking at the MJO and tropical cyclone activity in the Atlantic from a historical standpoint, 63% of the accumulated cyclone energy in the Atlantic Ocean occurs in MJO phases 1, 2, 3, and 4, which are basically the phases representing the upward motion in the Atlantic, in Africa, and then into the Indian Ocean. So we're working into a very favorable environment moving forward as we work into a likely MJO phase 1, 2, and 3 over the next 2 weeks, and then eventually phase 4 beyond that. In fact, if we break this down in a little bit more detail, 53% of major landfalling hurricanes in the United States happen in MJO phases 3 and 4, which we should see mid to late this month. 44% of hurricanes make landfall in MJO phases 3 and 4. And if we take a look at $1 billion weather disasters related to hurricanes in the United States, 46% of them have happened in MJO phases 3 and 4. So again, once we work to that midway point of the month and beyond, we're going to be in those phases. It is going to really amplify the opportunities for the United States to deal with major hurricanes and hurricanes in general mid to late August. In fact, I'm very concerned that as we work over the next couple of weeks, we could really get into maybe even a dangerous pattern in terms of hurricane activity along the Gulf of Mexico and up the East Coast. Taking a look at our favorite idea right now and just some other pattern drivers across the globe, I think our primary storm track is likely to be into the Gulf of Mexico. We've already seen 4 storms now across this particular region. Beryl, Debby, Chris formed in the Gulf of Mexico. And then again, we're watching for an additional storm to develop as we work over the next 7 days that could track into the Gulf of Mexico. I see no reason to think that the Gulf of Mexico continues to not be in the hot spot for activity as we work into mid to late August. But there could also be some storms out to sea in the Atlantic. In fact, if we look at some of our model data in the extended range, we're already seeing numerous different weather models indicating more development possible out in the Atlantic Ocean and in the Gulf of Mexico over the next 15 days. All that is to say, I think that we're going to need to keep a very close eye on the tropics. It's going to get very active very quickly. And I think the chances of additional hurricane landfalls and maybe even major hurricane landfalls are much higher than normal mid to late August. That's all that we have for today's forecast update. If you want to be updated throughout the storm, or you're planning an event, you're managing safety from a public standpoint, be sure to scan that QR code or go to bamwx.com. We are more than happy to help you as we do for numerous clients along the Gulf Coast and up the East Coast in hurricane season.